Perimenopause is actually happening 7 to 10 years before menopause. From as early as 35, women can start experiencing erratic cycles, shorter cycles, sleep disturbances, unexplained weight gain because they haven't changed anything in their diet. By age 40, our muscle mass is declining by 1% each year. Women need to start prioritizing muscle from a much earlier age. I'm not training for my beach body, I'm training for my old lady body.
Yes.
Why are not more people speaking about it? But 8 out of the 10 patients I see in my practice have got the same story.
Welcome to Smulcast, where we help you live a healthier and fuller life. Today we're going to be chatting about perimenopause, something that every woman will experience beyond a certain age, and yet it's a topic that is so under-discussed. Because this topic can be quite confusing and elusive, we're going to be chatting about what perimenopause is, the signs and symptoms, the hormonal shifts, and practical ways that you can navigate the season of life. We're joined by Dr. Ledivia Strauss, who's a medical doctor and has a focus on hormonal health. Ledivia, it's so wonderful to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Tracy. I really love being here.
Ledivia, can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you do the work that you do?
Well, as you know, I'm a medical doctor. I graduated from the University of Stellenbosch, and currently I have a medical practice where I specifically focus on women's hormonal health, a bit of aesthetic medicine, metabolic health, and then also detoxification and lifestyle changes. I feel quite passionate about this area of medicine because I feel specifically us as women having hormonal cycles are being firstly left behind when research is done. Because as you know, most of the research is actually being done in our male counterparts. So it's something that I think needs to be more spoken about and needs to, we need to do something about it. And why do I like to work with women in their perimenopausal years is also because of a bit of my own personal story. I had the privilege to live in France for 7 years with my husband, who was a professional rugby player at that stage of his life. And then I got into aesthetic medicine and also a bit of the integrative medicine space, and working with women, being quite vulnerable when they come to see you for Botox or dermal fillers. They started speaking about what's going on in their lives, and 8 out of 10 women in their mid-40s were telling me the same story. They were all very emotional, not being heard by the gynae or endocrinologist or psychiatrist or GP that they've been to. They've just been given an antidepressant or told, your symptoms are just part of the normal aging process, deal with it. And I went back to the drawing board and I thought, wow, there has to be something deeper to this. Why was I not told anything about this at medical school? Why are not more people speaking about it? But 8 out of the 10 patients I see in my practice have got the same story. And then lo and behold, when I turned 38, on my way to 39 a couple of years ago, I started experiencing weird symptoms. I had heart palpitations. I started having spells of anxiety, not necessarily anxiety attacks, but feeling more unsure of myself. And it was really a frightening time in my life, but because I was then already busy with my research and doing some extra studying also, I was able to diagnose myself, so to speak, being in early perimenopause, and then with certain lifestyle changes, educating the people in my family and the people that love me around me, and then also using supplements and medication as and when needed. I completely overcame all of my symptoms, and now at age 44, still in perimenopause, I can really attest to feeling and being the healthiest I've ever been. And this is why I feel it's a story that needs to be told. And we are so lucky to have trailblazers and heroes like Dr. Mary Claire Haver, Dr. Sarah Gottfried, Dr. Carrie Jones, Dr. Shonda Wright from the US. And I really think that all of us need to follow them on their social profiles because they are changing the conversation around perimenopause, menopause, and how it should be handled. And we are really lucky and blessed to be where we are in our careers at this stage, because I got my degree in 2004, 2 years after the Women's Health Initiative study came out. So I practiced in that stage where we were told that hormone replacement therapy were not to be given, it's dangerous. And luckily now all of these misconceptions are being debunked and the conversation is being changed. So I'm really blessed that we can be in this space together, and that we can hopefully change some lives along the way.
Absolutely. And so share this podcast everywhere, because I think having these conversations is so, so important. And just on that as well, that this conversation isn't just for women, this is for men as well, because chances are they will know someone in their life that is going through perimenopause or is going to go through perimenopause.
And they will understand them and what they experience so much better, and stop telling them it's just in their head. It's not just in the woman's head.
Absolutely. So let's start by defining what perimenopause is. How does it differ from menopause? Are there different stages? Can you just unpack that for us a little bit?
Okay, so as you know, we have this normal, regular menstrual cycle. 85% of women have a normal, regular cycle, where as we go through our lives, we have this up and down of the FSH, LH squirting from the pituitary gland, this message to the ovaries to make estrogen and progesterone in a cyclical fashion. And as you know, as women, we are born with all our eggs that we're going to have for the rest of our lives. It's being formed at about 5 months in utero. We get all our eggs, and that is the amount that we have for the rest of our lives. And as long as our eggs last, we will have regular menstrual cycles. But unfortunately, by the age of 30, about 10% of our ovarian reserve of our eggs we only have 10% left. And by the age of 40, we almost only have 3% left. And that is then also why the symptoms of perimenopause start happening. So what do we mean by that? Is then instead of having this perfect estrogen, progesterone going up and down, having this ovulation, forming the corpus luteum that can then squirt out progesterone. If you're not ovulating, you're not making progesterone. But your pituitary gland, firstly, the hypothalamus is shouting at the pituitary to make FSH. The FSH is giving the signal to the ovaries to make estrogen, but there's no progesterone to counterbalance and that is then when and why the cycles become a little bit more erratic, a little bit longer apart, a little bit more heavy, and why women then start experiencing certain symptoms. So we previously only knew about reproductive years, normal menstruation, and menopause. That's defined as 12 months without having a cycle. But perimenopause is actually happening 7 to 10 years before menopause. And according to research, the normal woman goes into menopause between the ages of 45 to 52. So if you count back 7 to 10 years before that, from as early as 35, women can start experiencing symptoms of having erratic cycles, shorter cycles, sleep disturbances. We'll get into the symptoms as we go along, but that is what perimenopause medically means.
That's really, really helpful, because I think, as you highlighted there, it's almost this missed season in a woman's life. We know about menopause, we know about reproductive years, but what about these 10 years, 7 to 10 years preceding menopause?
And it's something that women haven't talked about much earlier, because these symptoms were just being disregarded as a normal part of aging. And the statistics say that 90% of women were not properly educated on what will happen to them when their egg reserve is done. And 60% of women only start doing research about their cycles when they go into that area. And it's shocking to realize that they predict that by 2030, 1.2 billion people, women, will be in perimenopause or menopause. That is quite a significant number, and we cannot just brush them off as being old and just carry on with your lives. And that is why I think it's really important for women to know that perimenopause does exist, and there's a lot that we can do about it.
I think that's really helpful, that there's hope. There's something that we can do about it, and we'll chat a bit about that in a moment. Can you just highlight for us the stages of perimenopause and give us a bit of guidance around that?
Yes, and like you also alluded to earlier, it's quite a grey area, because it's not set in stone, and the sad part is there's not one diagnostic test that we can do to diagnose perimenopause. Menopause is easier. We do a blood test. We see the FSH and LH is above a certain number. The estrogen is done. A gynae can do an ultrasound to see that the ovarian reserve is done. So that's to diagnose menopause. But to diagnose perimenopause, there is no one blood test because your cycles are so erratic. Some hormones are still being produced, estrogen being produced a lot in 1 month and nothing in the next month, and just a little bit. There's no progesterone to counteract. So oftentimes patients come in and they ask me, can you please do a blood test? I want to know where I'm at. And then I tell them, it's impossible for me to evaluate your hormones while you're in this stage of your life, because when am I testing? So they've now gone and just put it into categories. So the two big categories that exist is early and late perimenopause, but I know Dr. Carrie Jones added a little other category that I find quite helpful, and that is where I was when I was 39, having to diagnose myself. So it's very early perimenopause, and the changes we see there is mostly due to progesterone that's starting to decline because you're not ovulating every month. And like I said, if you don't ovulate, you cannot produce progesterone because it's the corpus luteum coming from the production of the egg that is actually supposed to make progesterone. So progesterone's declining, and that is when we start seeing bouts of insomnia, being a little bit anxious, maybe feeling more bloated, maybe have shorter cycles, having worsening PMS. And then we have, so that's the very early perimenopause. Early menopause is where the progesterone is now declining and estrogen is sporadically too low or too high, like I explained now, because the pituitary gland is doing its utmost best to talk and shout at the ovaries to please make hormones, but some months it's just not happening, or it's happening too much and 2 eggs get released at a time. So because there's this mismatch between estrogen and progesterone, that is when patients often say, but I've got estrogen dominance. It just means that they've got too much estrogen relative to progesterone that's supposed to balance it. And then the symptoms going with that can be shortened cycles, again, anxiety, insomnia, brain fog is something I see quite often. Patients talking about suddenly gaining belly fat. And then the late perimenopause happens just before menopause. So that is when estrogen is then also going on a decline. So estrogen and progesterone production is almost stopping. And that is where women either haven't had a period for 3 months, or they have slight spotting and then go 2 months without a bleed, and then they have a heavy bleed, and then 4 months without a bleed. So they have more symptoms almost going into the bucket of menopause, when they start having hot flushes, where they struggle to stay asleep at night, where they feel really emotional, where they now really start struggling with their weight. Because as you know, they say the average woman picks up about 5 to 7 kgs of fat, and she loses between 3 to 5 kgs of muscle just by going into perimenopause. And that's really sad, because without changing anything in her habits and diet and lifestyle, she has this almost 10 kilogram discrepancy in her weight. So yeah, there's a lot going on that needs to be talked about.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, just to highlight the very early, the early and the late. And also it can be quite confusing for a patient, because menopause is a retrospective diagnosis. So we almost don't know when this line in the sand is going to be drawn. And without a blood test, we have to use symptoms a lot of the time, right? Can you also, you've touched quite a bit on estrogen and progesterone. Can you maybe just tell me where testosterone fits into that picture as well?
Yes, as you know, us as women, patients often tell me, no, but that's the male hormone. I don't want that. We want a lot of testosterone. So testosterone normally peaks mid-cycle. And that happens because that's when ovulation takes place. And like we know, the menstrual cycle is there to help us reproduce and to prevent us from becoming extinct. So we need to want to carry on with the generation. So we ovulate, and that mid-cycle spark in testosterone will then increase our libido, make us feel a little bit more lovable and wanted. And it also helps with cognition and with muscle building. So yes, testosterone peaks in mid-cycle, but we have testosterone production throughout the month. And testosterone is an extremely important hormone for women, for cardiovascular protection, for brain health, for, like I said, libido, for muscle building. it's such an important hormone that keeps being scraped off the table or just being put into this bucket. Now it's causing pimples and black hair growth, so we don't want that. We want testosterone, just not too much and not too little. They call it the Goldilocks hormone. Yes. It needs to be just right.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think a lot of women don't necessarily know about it and how it fits in. And I know in a lot of my consultations, women are asking, well, what is testosterone actually doing for me? So you've highlighted some of those things.
And
which is really
as you know, that testosterone is needed for estrogen production, because 17-beta estradiol is being produced from testosterone production. So obviously there's a couple of areas in our body that makes estrogen. It's the ovaries, it's the adrenal glands, it's the fat cells through aromatization. But testosterone is extremely important for us as females.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I heard somewhere that we should reframe testosterone as a human hormone rather than a male or female hormone, right?
Yes.
So if we appreciate that all the systems in our body are interconnected and our sex hormones are not operating in isolation, one of the big things that I see quite a lot in patients going through perimenopause are sleep disturbances. So can you just touch on what happens to a woman's sleep during perimenopause, what happens to their circadian rhythms, and how do the hormones influence that?
Yes, and I love that you mentioned now that it's not just the sex hormones that are important, because unfortunately when patients talk about hormones, they think it's estrogen and progesterone, and then some of them know about testosterone, but like you know, we've got almost 60 or 60 plus hormones in our body, and they all need to work together as this perfect hormonal orchestra for us to really feel our best. And can you guess who or what the master regulator of all those hormones are? You would know the answer, but to our audience, it's the circadian rhythm. And what does that mean? It means that we need to wake up with the sun, be at our peak and our best during the waking hours when the sun is shining, and then it needs to go down when the sun goes down. And that is the way our biology is created and how our ancestors actually lived. They lived by the circadian rhythm. They didn't have electrical lights to wake up and then carry on forever with the lights being on constantly. So they had to get up when the sun shines and wind down when the sun went down. So to get back to your question of sleep and how it's being influenced, progesterone is our calming hormone. Progesterone is needed for sleep. Progesterone is also one of the hormones that actually crosses the blood-brain barrier and elevates GABA. That's, like I said, our calming, sleeping, relaxing hormone. And because, like I mentioned earlier, progesterone is one of the first hormones to actually decline and not being produced as abundantly as previously, patients often struggle with telling me they either can't stay asleep or they struggle sometimes even to fall asleep. And together with that is our cortisol, the stress hormone, that's very, very much influenced by our circadian rhythm. So you have to wake up, have that peak in cortisol to keep you awake, to keep you alive, and then it needs a steady decline while melatonin, the sleep hormone, rises. But in our lives, where we are constantly stressed, constantly bombarded with different stresses, like somebody hooting at you in the traffic, you forgot to pack your kids' lunch, you had a fight with your husband, you missed a deadline, somebody upset you over the phone. So it's this constant spikes of cortisol throughout the day. And yes, we've got this wonderful adrenal glands and our wonderful system that can metabolize this, but when it is chronic stress, when it is constantly there all the time, that is when it's starting to influence our sleeping patterns, our glucose metabolism. And like we mentioned, we tell patients there's no one blood test to measure your sex hormones, but we can measure all these other hormones. And that is where in a consultation it's important for me to have a thorough history, take a thorough history of my patients and then test for their thyroid hormones, their stress hormones, their glucose and insulin, because as we go into perimenopause, closer to menopause, our cells become more insulin resistant. So the insulin levels rise, so the glucose metabolism is not as well regulated. And oftentimes I find that by just regulating their glucose metabolism, they sleep fine again before we have to go into proper hormone replacement therapy.
Well, I think that's a really insightful look into how some of the other hormones play a role. And I guess in a way that is part of what can confound some of the symptoms that a woman might experience. Yes. I've learned from clinical practice that the list of perimenopausal symptoms is extensive, right? And I've seen things from palpitations that you mentioned through to tinnitus or ringing in the ears to dry eyes. It's a really extensive list. And some of those can also be influenced by thyroid hormone or insulin and glucose dysregulation. But can you maybe just mention some of the most common symptoms that you see women experiencing in your practice?
Yes. And like you say, now maybe it's because we have got a higher index of suspicion when they come in. But I try not to ask leading questions. I let the woman tell me what she's experiencing. And after I've asked them the question, they often tell me. I ask them, well, why are you here for? What do you want me to help you with? And she said, Doctor, I just don't feel like I know my body anymore. I'm like an alien living, or it's me living in an alien body. Like I mentioned, anxiety is one of the symptoms I see most often. Insomnia, unexplained weight gain because they haven't changed anything in their diet, not being able to cope with their daily lives anymore, and then obviously irregular menstrual cycles, or they see changes in their cycle because us as women, we have about 450 menstrual cycles, so by the time we get to the end, we quite know what a cycle should be like, and they notice that they can't always put their finger on it, but they know that there's something off on their cycle. Or women nowadays often track their cycles. They tell me, I don't have a 28-day cycle anymore, it's 25 days now. It's consistent, but it's getting shorter and my days of bleeding is much worse. So those are the things I see commonly. And I have this slide in my practice on the screen that I show my patients when they ask me to diagnose them, and I say, but there's no blood test, but this is how I diagnose, and it's about, I think, 80 symptoms, and I ask them to just quickly scroll through it and tell me just as a percentage how many of those symptoms they have. And I want to tell you 9 out of 10 of them have got 9 out of 10 of the symptoms, like you mentioned, dry eyes. Frozen shoulder is another interesting one we see quite often, or just general aches and pains. They are not able to train as they would normally, because they suddenly have all these aches and pains they didn't have previously, or hot flushes, but not like her mum told her in menopause you have these constant nightly sweats. It's like on day 14 or the day just before their period, they suddenly experience a extreme night sweat in the evening where they don't know what's going on. It's quite frightening. When you get that first nightly flush, it's quite frightening. I can tell you from personal experience, but this is why I think it's so nice that we can validate our patients' symptoms. And I often have patients crying just because I'm not telling them, it's a normal part of aging, you're just imagining it. Just me telling them, wow, I hear you. I feel you. I'm living this with you, being a 44-year-old woman. We're going to help you. There's a lot of support that that can be given. And that's so special to see that moment in the consult.
Yeah, these symptoms, as you say, they're not psychosomatic. They're not made up.
Yes.
They're not just...
They sound psychosomatic, and... sorry to interrupt, but there was one of my patients. She's quite a high, functioning on a quite high corporate level, and she had a very high-end job. And she was often in a boardroom with a lot of male colleagues. And she came to see me and she said, Ledivia, you have to help me. I cannot cope in board meetings anymore. I have to present, or I have to give feedback, and my anxiety is through the roof. I have to hide in the bathroom. I'm crying. I cannot live like this. I'm actually contemplating retiring earlier. And I've since heard this from many women that they actually change their jobs or they retire because they simply cannot function on the same level that they were used to. And a shocking statistic is that the most common age group for women to commit suicide is in the perimenopausal above 40 age group, and it's very sad when you hear and see these things, and it's not being talked about enough.
I think that's exactly it. It's having the conversations, having women have access to information so that they can start identifying these symptoms for themselves and then finding access to help.
And you can still be as highly functional as you were before, because as you know, when we go into perimenopause, that's mostly the stages in our life where they say it's like reverse puberty. But I think it's much worse, because when you went into puberty, you were living under your parents' house. Mum made all the decisions for you. So she cooked your food. You only had to go to school. Now in perimenopause, your symptoms are in the reverse.
And you're doing all of those things.
You're doing all of those things. You are responsible for teenagers, probably. You've got aging parents you need to take care of. You're at the peak of your career. You're having a lot of stresses. A lot of divorces are happening in this stage of life. So we need to support this age group better, and we need to serve them better as a medical fraternity.
Completely. So let's chat about some of the things that women can do, and let's start with lifestyle changes. So are there any nutrition aspects that a woman might be able to consider in the perimenopausal season?
Yes, as you know me, I'm known as the 7 habits girl, because it's how we eat, how we move, how we sleep, how we detoxify, how we handle stress, how we interact with people or our community, and then medication and supplements. So yes, hormone replacement therapy is important, but it's only one of the 7 pillars, or one of the 7 habits that we need to address. And when we get to nutrition, to me, it's one of the most important pillars, because that's the one thing we have 100% control over. Nobody tells you or forces you to put something in your mouth. Somebody can put a plate of food in front of you, but you ultimately take the decision yourself to eat. So that's the one decision, if you really think about it, throughout your whole day, that you have 100% control over. So let's begin with that one. As you know, as we age, from the age of 35, we're starting to lose our muscle mass. It's really, really sad that by age 40, our muscle mass is declining by 1% each year. By age 50, we have lost so much of our strength and mobility. And that is why I think we need to shout it from the rooftops that women need to start prioritizing muscle from a much earlier age. And how do we do that? By eating enough protein, enough good quality protein. So we need to really look at what our protein intakes throughout the day is. So you know that the World Health Organization states that we need to consume 0.8 grams per kilogram, but we actually, research shows that it's 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram for a day. And for a normal 60 kilogram female, that equates to almost 120 grams of protein.
Which is a lot of protein.
If you go into that. So prioritizing protein. An unprocessed diet, so getting rid of the refined carbs and the refined sugars and the stuff that will really spike your blood glucose, and fiber. We need to really look into our fiber needs, because fiber feeds our gut microbiome, fiber helps with hormone regulation, and it's just an absolutely fascinating supplement or food group all around. So eating more fresh fruit and veggies, looking into the anti-inflammatory diet, and then prioritizing protein and the healthy fats, not the saturated fats. We really need to cut out the refined sugars, the saturated fats, and the processed foods.
That's really tangible. I like those. Although the protein, as we discussed earlier, is quite difficult to get that amount of protein. But if you plan ahead and you're cognizant of it, you can actually achieve those targets. You won't be perfect
every day, but if you really want to preserve and even build muscle, that is the amount that you will need to achieve that. Otherwise, you will just maintain or start breaking down.
The next pillar that I do want to touch on, a particular passion topic of mine, and I know it's a passion topic of yours, is exercise, because that's obviously a really big one when it comes to muscle, but also hormonal health. So can you chat us through exercise in perimenopause, what the best kinds are, and why it's important?
Thank you for the question. As you know, it's something that I love to do myself. And I think the straight answer is there is no one answer for everyone, but I want patients to choose a movement that they will be able to continuously perform. I find also if we take the word exercise out, or take the word you have to do it, then it becomes more a part of what we will do daily. So exercise, as you know, has been proven to prevent age-related cognitive decline. It's going to prevent and preserve muscle. It's preserving muscle and preventing future muscle loss. So that's why it's so important. And unfortunately, with women picking up weight in these stages of life, the first thing we do, we eat less and we exercise more. And how do we exercise more? We run, or we jump up and down on the trampoline. Everybody's into rebounding, and I'm not making it out as being the bad guy, but you cannot just do more cardio, and think that you will solve this problem. Your body and your physiology is inherently reacting differently to stimulus than it did before you went into perimenopause and menopause, and that is why you need to support your body. So as a rule of thumb, and there's a lot of research to support this, shows that if we can do strength training 2 to 3 times a week, and by strength training we mean any kind of movement that will challenge your muscles, that will build muscles. So you can do it with body weight, you can do it with dumbbells or kettlebells, you can do it with the gym equipment, with the machines, the circuit in the gym, or with bands, any kind of strength training that will build and preserve muscle. And then we do need cardiovascular exercise, absolutely, but it should not become the bulk of your exercise anymore. So I advise my patients to really cut down on the strenuous and erratic cardiovascular workouts, at least until we know what their stress levels are and what their stress hormones are doing also, because it's just adding fuel to the fire if you are constantly on this hamster wheel, so to say. So doing your 150 to 300 minutes of cardiovascular exercise, being that a long walk, a slow run, some swimming, some tennis, some biking, a stepper, any kind of cardiovascular movement. And I know there's a lot of research being done now around zone 2, where they say it's where you can still have a conversation. But unfortunately, most of that research is done in our male counterpart. So I believe that there's a lot of truth and a lot of value in that. But I would love to see more studies being done on female health. But if you prioritize strength training, cut down on your strenuous cardio and focus on movement, getting that 7,000 to 10,000 steps daily, that is extremely helpful. And I've helped numerous patients achieve their goal by just adding that in consistently.
Yeah, I think as a society we are quite under-muscled, as it were, right? And as you said, there comes a point in life at a certain age where things, if you don't try and address them, it's just going to decline, right? And then
we always joke
harder,
and we say, I'm not training for my beach body, I'm training for my old lady body. Because I want to be able to travel and carry my own bag. I want to be able to play with my grandkids one day. I want to be able to go on that trip with my husband. But so many women become frail in their older years, and it's something that could have so easily been prevented, but it needs to start from the age of 35 already. It's never too late. You know, there's ladies that start training in their 60s and they still achieve success, but it's just so much harder. So use what you've got while you still have it before you lose it.
And that's preventative health, right?
Exactly.
If you are in your 20s and listening to this, or in your 30s, start now.
Please
you might
do.
as well. Absolutely. I just want to touch on something. We spoke about a lot of the physical symptoms around perimenopause. And I know we've had this discussion a little bit earlier around some of the things that a woman might not actually feel that might be changing in the background. So things like bone density and cardiovascular health. Can you just maybe touch on how those are impacted by our hormones as well?
Yes. When we are younger, we have an abundance of the estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone for a specific reason. But as we get older, these hormones decline. And as new research is coming out, as you know, Dr. Lisa Mosconi is extensively studying the female brain and the influence of estrogen on our cognition and our brain health. And as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Von der Wright around bone health and estrogen, because estrogen is extremely anti-inflammatory, and the moment that starts decline, the inflammation in our bodies go up. So that is when we get that skeletal muscle syndrome of menopause, where we get all these aches and pains, and then also where our bone health declines. One of the best things that a woman can do to preserve her bone density is to do strength training and take estrogen when appropriate. So all of these sex hormones, so to speak, is extremely important for preserving our health and cardiovascular protection. Estrogen is extremely cardiovascular protective. As you know from the Women's Health Initiative study, that was one of the findings, one of the positive findings, where the cardiovascular risk, the stroke risk, actually went down in the group that got the estrogen replacement therapy. And we know now from research coming out that the earlier you start a patient, the more of that benefit you will get. But that's obviously a discussion that we can have on a later stage on how and when and how to replace when it's needed. But just realize that the hormones you have play an enormous role in preserving your overall health.
It's really important for women to know that, again, because they can then advocate for themselves and appreciate the benefit that they might get from those hormones. So we've touched on a lot of different things, and there's probably a lot more that we could discuss and say on this topic. So is there anything that you want to add or any message you would want to give to women that are going into perimenopause or currently in perimenopause?
Well, I think the most important thing that we've mentioned earlier, you are not alone. There's a lot of us going through this. Speak up, get help, do not suffer alone. There's a lot of things that can be done in this transition phase by ways of eating, by ways of training, by ways of handling stress better, and maybe speaking to your boss or to your spouse and explaining to them what's going on in your body for them also to better support you while you are getting back on track, because it is quite a rocky ride and it's not as simple as diagnosing perimenopause, putting the patient on medication, and by next month she'll be healthy. With or without a treatment plan, you are going through perimenopause for 7 to 10 years until you stop your period. So there are many ways that we can support our patients to really just have this transition as smooth as possible, but it is happening. You are not alone, and it's not just in your head.
That's really encouraging, and I think a lot of women will feel really validated by what you've shared, and just that message is really, really important. So thank you. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and your expertise on this topic. And for our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope that you feel that you've gained some really insightful information and that you feel encouraged. Perimenopause is a natural phase of life, but with the right knowledge and support, you can navigate it confidently. If you'd like to look more into our resources, check the links in the description below and stay tuned for more episodes on Smulcast. Until next time, keep living healthier and fuller lives.